I'd like to call the meeting to order of the Monday, July 18th Planning Commission meeting to deliberate on the Eugene 2035 Transportation System Plan. Our first item is usually public comment. As I understand, there is no one in the public wishing to comment at this time, so that we can move forward and expedite and go right to agenda item number 2, which are the deliberations on the Eugene 2035 Transportation System Plan. Excuse me, sir, do you wish to comment in public comment period?
Yes, please.
Could you fill out a green card and hand it in afterwards and go forward now as we're moving on the agenda items?
Okay.
And just state your name and where you live, please. Thank you. Since this is a public comment period, let me just say this, that you can, on any matter, you can comment on any matter except for items scheduled for the public hearing or public hearing items for which the record is already closed. So nothing can be said about what we're going to be deliberating on today.
Okay.
Okay.
And if the transportation plan is one of them?
Yep.
Okay. Then I won't mention that Sustainability Commission has already sent you communication on that, and hopefully you've reviewed it. The Thomas Price, Churchill Area Neighbors, Ward 7, one of your Sustainability Commissioners, mostly just trying to connect and listen in, so I'll be over there if you need any other help. But mostly we need to start thinking a little differently in our future. For those of you that have studied our carbon issues, we need to start actually looking to a future where we plan and create differently. And I'm just here as an environmental scientist who would like to bring some wisdom to that. If I can encourage you guys to seek that wisdom, you've got it in your community as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Price. With that, hearing no one else or seeing no one else wishing to speak, we'll move on to item number 2, deliberations, Eugene 2035 Transportation System Plan. And I believe I'll call on lead staff Kurt Yeiter.
We'll start with Catherine.
Okay.
Hi, good afternoon. Catherine Brotherton, Deputy City Attorney. I'm going to give just a real quick overview of where we are in the process, and then I'll pass it on to Kurt to talk about some of the summary of some of the issues. As you know, the record closed on Friday, July 8th, and there may have been a little hitch in the giddy up when it came to the packet that you received. The testimony that was received from June 21st, which was your public hearing, until July 8th, that has been now separately provided to you. It was included in the mailed packet to you, but it looks like there might have been an error in what was actually posted on the Planning Commission's website. When it comes to that attachment, it was attachment C. So the packet that you were just handed that's identified as attachment C, that is identical to what you have and what was mailed to you. But again, if you only accessed what was online, it doesn't appear. There's something got wonked, not sure what. But so you've got it all there. So we didn't have an opportunity to take all of that information that we got from the 21st until the 8th and put it into the public comment chart. You have the raw comments, but that bigger chart where we're going to summarize the public comment, provides responses, that will get what we received between the 21st and the 8th, as well as the public testimony that was received at the hearing, will eventually get wrapped into that bigger chart, probably around, because there was a lot of themes around certain topics. They'll be categorized so you don't have a lot of repetition within that chart. Staff will provide responses. If there is a recommended change, that will be included. And that will be provided to you before your September 19th meeting. That includes everything, as well as whatever additional questions you have today. In your packet that you did receive, there are responses, staff's responses to the questions that staff heard you ask at the June 21st hearing. A lot of those did cross over to what the public was raising as well. So there was a lot of what the public was addressing included in that, but those responses are there today. So what we're hoping to hear from you today is additional questions, issues that you would like to have answers to prior to your next meeting, which is scheduled for September 19th, as well as if there are changes that the commission would like to see made to the TSP prior to it coming back to you in September. It would be helpful for us if we had a good idea if most of you want to see those, either through head nods or a straw vote. For example, there's a recommendation from staff that the proposed reclassification to Arcadia, Kingston, and St. King Edward's Court be removed from the street classification map amendments. If that is something that the Planning Commission would like to see before they make a recommendation, it would be helpful for us if we had that direction from you today, to the extent you can give it, so then what comes back to you in September is closer to the version that you're seeking to recommend. The next meeting is scheduled for September 19th. There's another meeting scheduled after that for September 26th, if that's needed for further deliberations prior to recommendation. And of course, if there's more meetings needed, we'll get those scheduled as well. So we're hoping to have a robust discussion today about the questions that you raised, additional questions that you have, and moving forward to getting the plan how you want to recommend it.
Kurt?
So what we had time to respond to were most of the questions that the Planning Commission asked right after the hearing. So,
Kurt, could I ask you to maybe speak into a microphone and then?
yes.
Yeah, thanks.
So I'll touch on those, and then if there's more questions or if the commission disagrees or wants more, as Catherine said, bring it up so we can respond later. We had hoped, I still hope, that the majority of today's discussion could focus on the big theme of the levels of service, and it came up from the public and the commission. Julia Kuhn from our consulting team from Kittleson Associates is due here. I keep hoping she'll appear. She's coming down from Portland for this meeting, so she should be here very soon.
Probably the level of service has dropped on it.
It could be, yeah. That's she's testing out the Portland's reduced levels of service, getting out of town. So these are generally in the order that they were listed in the kind of questions and responses through. So I'll just skim through. Starting with Arcadia, we heard from a number of people questioning the reclassification of Arcadia. From a local, it's a network of streets, Arcadia, King Edwards, and Kingston, and a section of Willackenzie that would be changed. Since the reclassification would actually not result in a physical change to those streets, and then we heard a lot of concerns about what physical changes could come about, what that would mean to the neighborhood, we agree with the residents there that we can remove that reclassification from those streets without really any substantive change to that network of streets. So we agree with that.
Can I just add something, Kurt? The one real substantive change that would mean is that those streets would not be eligible for federal funding, because only collector and arterial streets are eligible for federal funding for the most part. I mean, a bikeway project on a local street might be eligible, but other than that, so if we wanted to do like a sidewalk infill project in those streets, it would not be eligible. And that was one of the reasons why we had originally thought to put it on in the first place. So I'm just sharing that information so you're aware of what the trade-offs are.
Okay. And to be clear, we have no plans on reconstructing those streets at this time. So, funding or not. Similarly, would have been discussed in some emails, but it was not a planning commission question, but we will respond to it later, is there were bike lane and sidewalk infill projects proposed on Lorraine Highway that brought up a lot of concern. Our recommendation would be to drop those two projects. we concur. There's probably not room to do that construction, and it was on a beyond 20-year list anyway, so it wasn't seen as a critical component to the pedestrian and bicycle network. So I mentioned that mainly for letting the public know that we've agreed with them on that. There was questions and discussion brought up about Beaver and Hunsaker. It's primarily from having to do with the county stuff. There's a response provided in the packet, but generally that's all subject to a study that's going on right now. And so my main response to you is we can let that study take its course and affect or not affect the TSP as the recommendations come out from that.
Kurt, can I ask you a quick question, just for the purposes of the public listening to this? What are the opportunities for public involvement in that process if the public is interested? And if you don't know, should they contact Becky Taylor?
I don't know. Becky Taylor would be the most logical contact. Becky Taylor with the County Public Works Planning. When Julia comes up to the table, she's also involved in that project and may be able to answer some more on that.
Perfect.
There's questions about the Beltline project, and the recommendation that TSP is that the Beltline facility plan be incorporated, and that would allow ODOT to complete the environmental review, the National Environmental Protection or Policy Act process. Yes, Julia Kuhn from Kittleson and Associates.
And
Thank goodness she's here.
I am so sorry. I got caught up coming out of Portland, so I apologize for being late. I'm always early, so my sincerest of apologies.
It's okay, you're not that late.
Yeah, I feel late.
Do you have input on public opportunities to follow or comment on the Beaver and Hunsaker study?
Yeah, so we had a really great meeting with the public here about a month ago up at the high school, and put forth a couple of design concepts for people to comment on that looked at various ways that we connect pedestrians and cyclists, as well as improvements to the existing Beaver Hunsaker. And I talked to Becky Taylor yesterday or the day before, and what we're going to be doing, we've gathered all the feedback and have summarized that, and we're going to be putting together a little newsletter/flyer for the public to summarize what we heard and kind of the next steps going forward. And then we'll be taking it in front of the Board of County Commissioners for not adoption, but for recognition as a corridor plan, so that the county can then start looking for funding to be able to begin some type of design process. So there's two components to the Beaver Hunsaker plan. One is physical changes to the Beaver Hunsaker alignment, and then the second is actually a north-south pedestrian bicycle trail between up to River Loop Road, I think, is the northern terminus, so that we can connect folks kind of on the basically adjacent to Delta Sand and Gravel, make a north-south trail along there. So we're pretty excited about the support that we got from the community and really a genuine desire for better connections within that area. There's also will be some additional follow-up with Lane Transit District LTD as they start to look at what they might do with that property and a station there at River Road and Hunsaker.
I had a question, might be related, only because you're talking about this. Becky also had a comment in there on Beaver Street concerning that it was rural. This was going to cause an issue as far as development out there and street improvements, and it was outside of the limits. It's one of the comments that are in our attachment.
Oh, that would be so one of the items that we looked at early on in the project was whether a roadway along Delta Sand and Gravel heading northbound would be merited to provide some north-south connectivity. And one of the key issues associated with that roadway is it actually is outside the urban growth boundary. And having a roadway that serves urban uses outside the urban growth boundary would require a goal exception, would require the county to apply for a goal exception from the state of Oregon. And we as staff went through an exercise where we compared all of the goal exception criteria to what we believed were the merits of this particular roadway and actually ran those by ODOT. And we came to the conclusion, as did the project management team, that a goal exception to support a roadway outside the UGB in that alignment would be very, very difficult, if not impossible, to get from the state. However, pedestrian and bicycle facility can be developed outside the urban growth boundary without a goal exception, and so that's the direction that we're moving forward with.
So it's being addressed then. Thank
It
you. I
is.
just wanted you to hit two birds with one stone then.
Thank you.
I see a question here from Commissioner Taylor.
So did you have your public meeting after June 21st, after the hearing?
For the Beaver Hunsaker project, no, it was it was around the 15th, somewhere. Yeah, yep.
Yeah, so we did hear from the public during the hearing. So it sounds like even though it might have been a successful public meeting, that there are still questions. So making sure maybe to follow up with those individuals or reaching out further.
I'll talk to David as well, and we did meet with Commissioner Bosevich as well right in advance of the meeting and outlined all of the technical analysis that we had done, and we had a nice question and answer session, and he's been meeting with several of his constituents out there as well, so briefed us on the questions he's been receiving too.
Thank you.
Should introduce, if the commission doesn't know, David Reesers with the County Public Works Transportation Planning Group. So he's here for Becky in this context. Okay, the topic of Beltline, and again, Julia may be able to help with this, but the question was if we didn't include the facility plan, what might happen? And one, congestion would continue to get worse, and the duration of congestion would continue. The old bridge, the existing bridge, would still need some upgrades over time. We would still be trying to pursue some safety improvements. There's a high crash rate on the existing Beltline facility. But most importantly, I think the opportunities that we see that the facility plan identified for improving safety and increasing opportunities for pedestrian, bicycle, and transit, better access across the river, as well as accommodating future growth in traffic, would be lost if we did not pursue the larger options here. So generally our recommendation is to keep the facility plan in and let the environmental review continue. Anything else that Julia's on, like every project team here, so it's a great resource.
I'd be happy to answer any questions. I think you summarized the key issues.
Yeah, Bree.
I think it would be just helpful to know really fast with the Beltline process. So could you just give a little bit of information about where we are in that process right now? Because it sounds like including the facilities plan provides us the opportunity to examine this issue more in depth, but there will still be hopefully an opportunity for the public to engage and actually provide feedback through the NEPA process. Am I understanding that correctly? Could you talk a little bit more about that
Sure.
timeline and those opportunities?
So where we're at right now is we are undertaking a smaller component of the Beltline project. The facility plan has been acknowledged, and we are looking at how do you provide some improvements at the Delta Highway Beltline interchange, particularly the eastbound direction, so the eastbound off-ramp. So if you're coming across the river and then wanting to get off at Delta and either heading northbound or southbound, what are some things that can happen with those ramps to really improve upon the safety? Because as you all know, one of the key issues out there is someone who's coming on and someone who's getting off, and it results in congestion and some rear end crashes. And so what kind of things can we do? And so we're looking at some changes to the ramp configurations at when you get off Delta Highway, as well as when you so mostly when you get off Delta Highway. So we're in the process right now of looking at some designs and some operations and working with ODOT staff to figure out what type of things you can do, because ODOT has a limited amount of money that's left over from another budget. I think it's about $20 million, and we're trying to figure out, can we put these safety improvements in place for the budget that they have available from the leftover. Actually, I think it was from Beltline I-5 is where the leftover came from. So those are some of the more near term. One of the things I've heard from ODOT staff is they're waiting for the Eugene TSP to go forward before beginning the NEPA process for the overall River Road to Delta Highway and NEPA to begin. And one of those issues is, as we were talking about before, some of the uncertainty about what will be included in the TSP, the adopted TSP related to the Beltline Highway and particularly the local bridge improvements. And so the sense I've gotten from ODOT staff is once there's been an action taken on that, we'll have better direction on where NEPA will go. So that will begin a multi-year process with plenty of opportunities for public participation to shape how the actual design of Beltline improvements take place.
And just so you know, it's standard operating procedure for ODOT that when they develop a facility plan in a community, that the elected body has to approve that facility plan. And the way it's happening here is that it'll be through adoption of the TSP.
Thank you for that clarification.
Follow-up question on the public participation. There seems to be public participation, let's just say, on the west side as it connects with River Road. But there were comments submitted, I believe, by Northeast Neighbors, which talked about the impacts on Crescent because of this project. Is there anything being done to address that?
That will be done, so in light of the TSP or in light of Beltline? I guess it's
In light of it being addressed, either way, it doesn't matter to them, I don't think. But is it going to be addressed, those impacts, the same way they're looking at on the west side of the bridge?
as part of Beltline. That would be one of the issues. I know we did, as part of the facility plan, we did get some comments from folks, the Northeast Neighbors, and actually met with them a number of representatives from the neighborhood a number of times to talk through what some of the concerns are. So when we go further into the Beltline process, that will indeed be part of the discussions that take place. And one of the key components of the Beltline project is not just what happens along the Beltline itself, but what happens on the arterial bridge and the adjacent streets to make sure that the system is functioning. And as Kurt mentioned, one of the things that particularly excites me about the Beltline project is the local bridge, and it's the ability for folks to go from east side to west side of the river without having to get on the Beltline and get into all the weaving and merging. So if I want to go over to Market of Choice and I live in Santa Clara, I can pop on my bike on the bridge, or I can drive right over without having to get on Beltline. And so much of that local traffic happens today on Beltline, which forces people into their cars for shorter distance trips. I'll get off my little grandstanding for a second.
But it's an opportunity now to acknowledge that we got written comments too from Northeast Neighbors at the hearing that asked questions about the congestion and maybe need for more projects at the Crescent and Coburg Road area, which will be addressed both by Beltline and will give a written response back to the commission here also. Next issue was skateboards, and the question was, how does the TSP deal with skateboards as a mode? It's mentioned in one place. We consider it an active mode, and legally, skateboards are treated similarly to pedestrians. They're not considered vehicles. The issues come up several times from the public, mainly in response to the Vision Zero, the safety policy, saying make our roadways safer. There's been discussions in the past about whether we should change our rules to encourage skateboards in bike lanes where those are available instead of sidewalks. And there's mixed opinions. Cities do it different ways. The TSP does not change how we do that. So if that's a recommendation that we pursue that could just come up verbally. It could be a potential action added to the TSP or policy, but that's.
We did study that a couple years ago when we made changes to the no biking and skateboarding on the sidewalk area downtown, and we studied there are 4 cities in Oregon that allow skateboarding on city streets: Ashland, Salem, Portland, and Corvallis, and we didn't reach internal agreement about what to recommend.
Right.
But that can certainly be something that the planning commission decides to look at.
And I don't know if it needs to be addressed in the TSP. It could be just in the code as far as, where they're legally allowed to ride.
Right.
Instead of putting it through here. It was just a public comment and kind of.
Commissioner Randall?
Yeah, I think as somebody who walks and bikes and drives, I think it seems like skateboards to me would be more akin to biking rather than walking. I know the times I've encountered skateboards, it seems to make more sense if they're in a bike lane or more in the street than certainly on a sidewalk. And so again, I know that doesn't really affect the TSP particularly, but I think as we move forward, it seems like a skateboard is, in my opinion, more like a bike than a pedestrian.
So we could have an action in the TSP on that. I don't believe we do right now, but that's something you could recommend to council, that there be an action to change the city code to allow skateboarding in the street. But right as of now, skateboarding is prohibited in the streets in Eugene.
Is that, do you think, an appropriate place for that to happen, or should that just be something separate? Rather than as part of the TSP, I mean, does that kind of cloud what we're trying to do here?
If it's under a potential action item, I mean, you'll see that there are some potential action items that actually go beyond what we would address in the TSP, which is why there isn't a policy in the TSP on it. But to have it a potential action item, I think that's completely appropriate for the TSP, because that's the future work that will be done outside of this.
Kurt, I might have missed something. Are we coming back later, or did you skip 3 and 4 for a reason?
LOS?
LOS, what I was trying to do is get everything else off the table,
Okay,
and then we can dive in.
All right, good. Just wanted to make that clear. Okay.
Yeah, thank you. There's a question on complete streets, and heard from several members of the public, too, on that it's unrealistic to expect complete streets that provide basically maximum facilities for all modes and landscaping on all streets all the time. The way we tried structuring this is that the policy says essentially we need to consider complete streets. We need to accommodate access by multiple modes of transportation to all places within the town. And then there are, and some of you may recall, it used to be a huge policy, and then we've broken it. So the policy's shorter, and then there are potential actions that talk about setting up guidelines and better articulating how the complete streets policy would be implemented in code or in design actions. So it's structured. Basically, what we're hoping is that all modes would be considered in creating design standards, in redesigning any street, in doing our key corridor studies. Anytime we are considering a new street design or change, physical change, that all the modes are considered, but then priorities are given and as better articulated, I think, in the potential actions, it would set up that complete networks would be the result, so that one can get around within a neighborhood by the different modes. but that each street need not accommodate them all itself. Given that, if it's not clear, or if it should be changed, this is an opportunity for the commission to give us guidance or make a recommendation to the city council to say, you know, this isn't clear, do it differently. As is, we would probably within a year or two have new street design standards and guidelines on how this would be implemented that would articulate it. So, yeah.
Just a quick question on that. So then, I guess, what would trigger that? Would a reconstruct of a street trigger a design change? So,
Yes, and as we do now, if there's even the pavement preservation projects
Right, exactly.
where
That's
we come in
kind of
to
what I'm
repave, even now, we look at what opportunities there are and consider, is there room for sidewalk improvements? Can we fit in landscaping? Can bike lanes be added? So that thought process is already somewhat in place.
right.
At least at the staff level, and then choices are being made now. If there isn't the right of way to accommodate, that's decided. In many ways, the Complete Streets policy is putting in writing and articulating a lot of what happens at the staff level now.
Right. And I guess what I was, I've seen that in the street bond repair type of thing. When that happens, a lot of other things happen. You know, if there's room for a bike lane or whatever, they'll redo that. But funding is iffy there, because you can't use street bond money as it's passed right now for other than curb to curb, basically. And so then you're pulling from different pots to get to the complete streets. And so that's just kind of where I was wondering if it was a trigger. And the next question would be, so on Willamette Street, we had the trigger is that it was going to be repaved, so that's where it decided to go more towards a complete street. So if this policy were enacted and none of what happened with Willamette happened, would it have probably gone to that configuration under this policy?
Well, just to be clear, like, the reason why what happened on Willamette happened is because there's been a project listed in the TSP for decades calling for bike lanes on Willamette Street.
Okay.
And so
Okay.
several years ago, we got around to studying that. And I think one misconception that some people in the community have is that if a project is listed in the TSP, that the city is just going to go in and implement it. So, like, I heard a story about how in Chicago, the business owners found out about protected bike lanes that were removing their parking. When the parking was being removed, they went outside and their parking was gone. And we would never do things that way here. We always do a robust public comment, public engagement process where we engage the stakeholders, and then ultimately a decision is made about whether to move forward with the project. And the amount of public involvement is really tailored to what the impacts are and the trade-offs are. So, like with Willamette, and also just the amount of community interest. So, well, you know, there's a lot of smaller projects we do where we're sort of making a street more of a complete street, where there's this, you may not hear about it, but we're reaching out to people on that corridor. And then there's larger projects like the Willamette one, where it was really there was a community-wide interest. But regardless, just because something is listed in a plan does not mean that the city is just going to go build it.
Good. And that's kind of what I was getting at, is if this is put in there, then do we have, you know, it's maybe losing a road diet, or it would be losing on-street parking in front of a neighborhood or stuff like that. And if that happens, that would be all vetted with the affected neighborhoods or property owners probably before that. It wouldn't, just because it's in the policy, you would say, okay, it's in the policy, you had your chance to comment on that.
We don't have the resource to do all that outreach for the TSP itself. It would just be enormous to do that for every project listed in the TSP. So,
Okay.
And I think the policies that are in here are internal direction to staff. So, and if Mark Shoney were here, he would say, we already have an unwritten complete streets policy. We're already implementing that and doing that. But so what this does is articulate it and tell staff, okay, this is what you're going to want to do. And then, but again, like Rob said, then we'd go out on a project by project basis.
Commissioner Randall?
I think on this, if what we're trying to say in the policy is that we're going to try and do complete streets, and if we're not able to do a complete street, we're going to try and do as much as we can. We'll try and get bike lanes, or we'll try and do this, or we'll get 60% there. I think we could word that a little better. I'm not sure it's quite there yet on the wording, and I'm not sure, I don't have any suggested wording at the moment, but I think we could maybe say that a little better and a little clearer to say, you know, we're going to consider this, we're going to try and do complete streets, but if we can't, if we don't have the right-of-way or whatever, we're going to do the best we can. And I don't know if that's, I don't know if that passes muster on a plan with the state, if we just say we're going to do the best we can, but some way of articulating that a little clearer, I think, would be good.
Yeah, there's some language in it, but it's in the actions, potential actions,
Okay.
talking about incremental implementation. So we can do this now, but if we had more right-of-way in the future, we could do more,
Good
things
point.
like that.
Yeah.
But, you know, maybe that could.
Yeah.
Yeah, we can.
Yeah, it might, yeah, just a little
reflected.
bit of fleshing out, I think might help.
Commissioner Taylor?
So I just wanted to clarify, to understand how we're actually addressing this. Are we addressing each of these point by point? Kind of the approach I've been taking is just listening, and then we'll respond to them later. So I just want clarification of how we're.
What's your
how we wanna-
preference?
As I understand, Mr. Yarder was going to go through the questions and responses here, and that the commission could then ask questions in response to each one of them. And if they also related to other testimony, probably included at that time to make it more fuller. I think I did that once where I said that was related to this. So feel free to bring it into that while it's being addressed, that component.
So if we have follow-up items, just wait till the end. For instance, Commissioner Randall, if there's policy suggestions, wait till the end, or do you want us to address it?
You mean in rewording?
Yeah,
Okay.
the skateboard question, et cetera. Do you want us to wait till the end or address them as he's?
Seems like we've been just kind of jumping in, so.
I was actually holding off.
I was holding
Oh,
off.
okay.
Yeah.
I was thinking that when he went through whatever there are, 17 or 18, before we even got into laws, because that might be detailed, I was going to ask, do we have any kinds of recommendations on the 8 or 9 that we had discussed at this point?
Perfect.
If that's okay? Because I noticed people are making notes. I wrote notes about rewording number 10 and et cetera.
Okay, perfect.
Okay, is that under, okay.
There's a question about the process for removing parking. So you're provided, there's code procedures specified in our Eugene code. But then in addition to that, staff works with, as Rob just articulated, the property owners, businesses in an area to go through that, so.
I have a follow-up to that, and I understand when I read this, I believe, I'll mention it, Teresa Bichel with Crescent Village wrote and had a concern that city could come in and remove parking, although it was approved within a PUD and all those other kind of things. And I guess that kind of a question was this allows certain things, but does it even, EC 5.040 allows certain things for the engineer to do, but does that allowance override what's something that was in a PUD and already approved through that as a method? I think that's what the question was that Crescent Village raised.
It's a good one. I'll look to legal, but.
Well, I mean, that's interesting. I didn't look specifically at that. I can. I mean, it depends on, I mean, an approved PUD, if we're talking about constructed and the parking is there, I mean, 5.040 is a separate management of our public ways by our traffic engineer. So generally, yes, but that doesn't mean.
Guess what?
Yes, you could, yes, 5.040, I mean, it would override it, an approved PUD, but that doesn't mean it would be, or that was the approach it takes, because the findings that have to be made to to take an action under 5.040 require findings of consistency with a whole bunch of different things. And if there is an approved plan that takes made a bunch of considerations to have sidewalks there, then the findings actually wouldn't support the removal occurring. But I'll look closer at that specific question. This was a general explanation of the process that's followed. But if the specific question is would 5.040 override an approved PUD, I can answer that. I can get you a more specific.
Thank you.
And for what it's worth, my sense is that's because that's proposed to be, the street she's concerned about is proposed to become a neighborhood collector.
Yeah.
We almost never put bike lanes on neighborhood collectors, and I think that's probably what she was concerned would trigger the parking removal.
Okay.
So my sense is that that's not really a concern at that location. And we are going to be updating the city's street design standards relatively soon. The process will be kicking off, but I doubt that there'll be much change to how we treat neighborhood collectors, at least from like whether or not there's a bike lane issue. And then, of course, there's what I talked about earlier is we reach out to the community, engage the community, and what's the right kind of bicycle facility for this street. So,
Thank you. I'm just trying to hit other comments that were made so that we don't have to bounce around a lot later. Commissioner Taylor.
I actually brought up that question because there was another comment made by the public that they had a concern that parking was just going to be removed and what that process was. So really it's outlined, you've actually addressed it. And I think you looking at the PUD, for instance, and Rob, you did a good job, is for the public to understand what that process looks like, that through 5.040, that the city manager or the city engineer isn't just going to remove parking through that process without public input, without consideration of existing context, including potentially land use. So I think it would be good to maybe follow up with that more formally, just because there was not just one comment, but a couple of comments.
If I may, with regard to shadow view, which there's a question that came up later here, we will be responding to that in more detail. We got a letter in from the Crescent Village folks during the open period, so there'll be more responses to that. We clarify that just because we proposed a reclassification of shadow view did not indicate, and we do not have plans to restructure that street along there. It's, as far as I can tell, it's working perfectly. It was designed for that, the kind of village center setting, and there's nothing in the works that would physically change that street going now.
we're talking about the part north of Crescent, right? In particular.
Yes. Yep. So anyway, there'll be more coming to you on Shadow View Drive. Question came up about emergency responses, like during a disaster times, and resiliency of the community and the street's role in that. That component of the TSP is not addressed in the TSP because when we started the TSP update process, there were other studies starting at the same time that were addressing natural hazards, mitigation, community resiliency, responses to disaster, and all that. So now we have a TSP, and there are some other plans that have recommendations for this. And so there's a vulnerability assessment and a natural hazards mitigation plan. You know, in your written responses, I noted there are 3 kind of recommended actions or policies that came out of those other plans that, if you want, could be incorporated in the TSP also, but they do exist in other plans.
Because I asked that question, just to kind of say the thinking behind that, because I didn't get a chance to do that in the public hearing. Having just gone through the 5-year pre-mitigation grant process with Marion County, having as many mentions of these different actions in as many of your plans as possible is just a better way to further ensure that you have a stronger report when you do that 5-year update. And so just crosswalking it into the TSP is kind of just the thought behind that. And so we can include these actions as robustly if they're already in the other plans. It could even just, or I was thinking even just a simple mention of a sentence. But yeah, incorporating those in helps us be stronger applicants.
Agreed. And then some of the other pieces in the TSP that are, they don't bring it out as explicitly as perhaps they should, but there's future studies for upgrading bridges over the river, and that's one of our main points of vulnerability, are the bridges over the river, and studies for additional crossings. So the TSP sort of puts that off, but that may be, we could better tie that to disaster response. There's a question about 20-minute neighborhoods and what the effects of that may be on businesses. So there's quite a lengthy written response. There's nothing in the TSP that would, one of the concerns, as I understood it, was removal of parking. And that's not proposed through the TSP, but rather periodic updating of our parking requirements could be done. So I think one of the fears is that we may be requiring more parking than what is necessary or desired of developers or of businesses when the means of getting to those and within those neighborhoods are being improved by the pedestrian realm, bike lanes, improved transit service. So that's been addressed. Some questions on funding priorities and project priorities. Some of that, I think, can be addressed later with more full. Well, as far as the funding aspects, I will point out that an effort was made in the TSP to limit the number of times we say this is a priority. Because in earlier draft, there were so many priorities, it got muddy and you wouldn't be able to tell what was focused. So currently, there's priorities for safety improvements, transit improvements in the key corridors, so that aligns with the Envision Eugene. Priorities of bikeways and pedestrian improvements, and moving towards the the goals that were articulated in climate recovery and incorporated into the TSP. And then there's a hierarchy of priorities for how to fund the street improvements. So the top priority is protecting what we have, protecting and maintaining our street structure. Second is improving the efficiencies of our existing structure. So that could be by through technologies and signal improvements and things of that nature. It could be by adding transit or adding new modes like the bike lanes on Willamette to allow more people to travel within the same right-of-way. The third priority is to add capacity. That may be by widening a street. And last is adding new streets, except where new streets are needed to open up vacant lands for development. So those are the priorities that are put in. If you had more questions on, which wasn't clear from the question, but on how, when funding becomes available, how we choose projects, but generally what I just outlined, safety, new modes, protecting like pavement preservation projects, and improving the efficiency would remain our highest priorities for the funding. And I already addressed shadow view. So that's, and that left, unless there's other questions on those, we skipped over several questions that have to do with levels of service, which we can address next when you're done.
Would the commission at this time like to go into 3, 4, 7, 8, 9, which is level of service, or do we want to go back on the ones we just said and make some comments or recommendations, or wait? Commissioner Taylor.
I'm open to any of them, I would say, just because it's, the conversation's fresh. I mean, to be able to close that section would be great.
Okay, why don't we do that then? We'll go back and go through the items that you mentioned to see if any of the commissioners have for discussion some recommendations, and we'll come back to the LOS.
Questions?
Okay. Commissioner Mills.
I have two, and this is the one you just completed, Kurt. It's on project priorities, and you listed them out versus protecting, then improving, then adding capacity, then new streets, 1, 2, 3, 4. Before that, you preambled by talking about safety. Can you give me again how safety lies relative to those 4 priorities and how it's treated in context?
It's listed separately through that. Generally, I'd say it's consistent with the improving what we have. But there is a priority, it's an outgrowth of what some call the Vision Zero policy that the city council's already adopted, which essentially says that deaths and serious injuries in our transportation system are unacceptable. And so when we look to improve streets or I think there'll be a new priority of looking where injuries and crashes most often happen, of how can we retrofit those streets to make those better.
I would suggest that right now it's kind of off on the side. I know there's a policy for it, but it's not in code, it's not in the plan. I mean, it is in words, but if it was a priority, then it would be more in our thinking than it is for the long term. In other words, of course, then you're going to get into what is safety and what is not. But I'd rather have those discussions than not have them. So I have a concern that it's not one of those 4 or 5 priorities. That safety is not one of those priorities, and I think it should be. And my second question is just to understand the history around Arcadia. In reading some of the responses, I believe I read that at one point a barrier was removed that changed the traffic flow on that street. And my question is, how was that? What procedure was followed for removing of that barrier? Basically, in effect, in hindsight, changing the character of the street.
Generally, and I don't know the history or the specifics to know if an actual, like a guardrail was removed that had separated 2 streets. My thought was it was probably connecting 2 streets with a new subdivision. A new street made the connection through there. Generally, we encourage street connections and making it possible to travel via the streets or walkways and whatnot. More connections, more ways of moving throughout the city. Where that causes the most heartache, and we heard about it with Arcadia, is where connections are made, but the whole neighborhood is not well connected, and some streets get a concentration of traffic that didn't have it before. Now, in the area throughout the Harlow neighborhood, there's old county streets before the area is annexed. A lot of sort of north-south streets are long, straight streets, not improved to city standards. They don't have sidewalks. They may be wider than what we would require if they were built new. And there's not a grid pattern throughout that neighborhood where cars have choices on how to go through, or not other streets that are intended to carry all the traffic, like a major collector or so, like Garden Way or something. So there's few of those connecting. So when a connection is made, like an Arcadia, or a barrier removed, and I don't know which happened, but then people are finding their way through, concentrating more traffic on that series of streets that didn't exist before.
As a follow-up, there's been a number of public forums that we've been in where I've heard concern from existing neighborhoods about added connectivity and how they're absolutely very concerned about it. And in this case, I guess I'll just go back again and say, and ask the question, not expecting it to be answered at the table. How did that happen? How did we change that? And I'd like to understand what process was used to basically make a decision that this had to be done, and what was the public participation in that decision?
So if I can, for clarification, so when we come back, are you more concerned on philosophically broad wide connectivity or specifically
I guess it's
what happened
philosophy.
here, or both?
Because, right now, we changed it to collector because the number said to change it to collector. Now we're recommending to change it back to not a neighborhood collector, and the only impact is the impact is a lack of eligibility for some federal funding for future improvements, as I understand.
Well, just to be clear, it's never been a neighborhood collector. We were just recommending that.
Because the numbers
Draft TSP.
show it.
Right.
Right. So, no, I understand that, and now, so we're trying to take it to where the numbers say it should be. And, but now we're saying, well, okay, if they don't want it, then we'll take it back, but the numbers say it is. So it seems a little arbitrary. I'm concerned about the arbitrary nature of the decision-making here, where we removed a barrier, changed the character of a street, and now we're trying to make the numbers match, but if the neighbors don't want it, then we'll change it back. I'm just trying to understand how this happened and how the decision-making process is consistent or not.
Now, this was over at least a dozen years ago.
No, I
This happened
understand.
Probably well before that. And I think there was at some point a change in the city policy around having more connected streets. So that may be, it may be a challenge
how.
for us to dig that far back, but we'll try.
Okay.
So.
Before I
Thank you.
call Commissioner Borowski, on the issue that was brought up under number 16 for safety, did you suggest, Commissioner Mills, that safety be a highest priority, or that safety be written in this the same way under item number 4, when it says it's a new street on connectivity, it moves up a level, that if there's a safety issue, and although it's a number 4 priority, it could move up levels?
I think that those kinds of difficult discussions are worth having.
Okay.
I would place it as number 1, but of course, I'm one person in this community. But I think to not have it as a priority is dangerous.
Okay. Do we want, I have Commissioner Borowski, then Commissioner Taylor. Go ahead.
Yeah, just to piggyback on a couple of the things that Commissioner Mills brought up. I think that since we do have an action by the City Council with Division 0, that needs to be prominent in the TSP. And where that goes, I don't know, whether it's in the prioritization or whatever, but to make it clear that was something that was passed by the elected body should be reflected in this. Then the other question I had is, as far as changes of street classifications, we know of one that rose to a high level. I'm just wondering if there is a list of ones that are going to be going up in classifications that the neighbors may not even be aware of, because the map is pretty small, and knowing what it was before and what it was after. Is it possible to have a list of the ones that will be going up in classification?
Yes, and the map is small.
Yes.
But in the draft ordinance that you were provided, those are actually set out in a chart.
Okay.
And Kurt can speak to this, but my understanding was notice was sent to everybody.
Okay, and that was the other question. Was there notice sent out to people that are going to have it upgraded? Okay, great, thank you.
I have Commissioner Taylor, Commissioner Randall, and then Commissioner.
So I think I'm just going to follow suit and stay concentrated on 16. I have comments from the other areas, but it looks like, Kurt, clarify if I'm wrong, the first bullet point on number 16 is, in terms of priorities, is to prioritize safety improvements. And I had the same comment, is when it says the last bullet point that has the sub-bullet points of protecting the existing system, improving the efficiency and safety of existing facilities. Sorry, it's on page 12 of the PC.
No, that's fine. I'm looking for the policies in the.
Yeah, I was looking.
Because they're just
for-
listed, they're in separate places.
Yeah, I was looking for that as well. So one of the things that, because I think safety is addressed, and one thing I'm noticing just from these sub-bullets is that Under protect the existing system, improve the efficiency and safety of existing facilities, add capacity, is maybe just specifically adding a sentence relating to safety in Vision Zero. I mean, it could be as simple as that.
And if I could, when we look at the goals, policies, and action, there is kind of the 4, 5 goals. that are
Goals,
over-
exactly.
And safety is in goal 1.
Yep.
It doesn't call out Vision Zero, so if that is a desire, but it is create an integrated transportation system that is safe and efficient. And so
Yeah.
you see safety wound in really many, many, many different ones, but what I'm hearing is make, like we've got a system-wide policies, something specific maybe to Vision Zero or
Yeah.
something like that.
I definitely agree with Commissioner Nicolello, is whenever we already have, if we have another adopted plan or ordinance or action, be able to link it and provide that context, because it is prioritized through another decision that was made from City Council. And I don't know, once again, like Commissioner Borowski, I'm not sure the best way to do that, but doing it more effectively might be helpful.
If I can, adding safety in the one policy that lists the 4 priorities is what came to my mind too, and it's an easy fix. But there is a system-wide policy that says, consider safety first when making transportation decisions.
Yep.
And so, it seems clear. I will point out, you may appreciate it was a recommendation from former Commissioner Randy Luddick, who said, one of the things he learned on his term as planning commissioner is often there are terms of art or references to plans or phrases used that seem clear at the time, but 5 years later,
Good point.
you don't know what they are. So
That's a good point.
we did not use Vision Zero here, and instead pulled what the meaning of Vision Zero is here, so that 5 years, if that's fallen out of favor, we can do it.
Yeah.
We could build that back in if you want.
Maybe I think that it's important to recognize what you just called out. So I don't know if there's a way to bring it in, but still don't replace safety with that word, but bring it in a way that's a reference with a date and some context. But I agree with you. Let's not overcomplicate it. I think that's great. Thanks.
I have Commissioner Randall and then Nicolello and Mills.
Well, and I was going to just refer to Better Eugene Springfield Transit's comments, PC Agenda, page 42, where they specifically recommend some changes in the wording to make that a little stronger. So as you're going through that, maybe consider that. I don't know if that's the best wording or not, but I think it's certainly stronger than what's there now and where we land.
Okay.
Great.
Commissioner Nicolello?
Yeah, well, actually, I can continue the Vision Zero conversation. In full disclosure, I'm on the board of directors for Better Eugene Springfield Transit, so I was one of the people who helped pass this policy. That being said, I think that Commissioner Luddick's concerns are actually really important and valid, and I'm probably going to have an awkward board meeting on Wednesday when I suggest this, but I think that simply referencing the ordinance is fine, and I think you get at the heart of what the policy is. The heart of the policy is to make safety first, say no deaths on our streets are acceptable, and that education, enforcement, and good engineering are what will guide us. And also, too, as part of this, and Rob Interfeld has been a wonderful part of this, is we're going to be pulling together a Vision Zero task force and also coming up with some strategies on how to actually implement that. So the TSP, just having a mention of it, really helps that come along, but that will be a separate piece that's going on. I really was hoping actually to dig into just the funding piece really fast. I have brought up before the thought of looking at maybe putting in a policy that would assist in helping local funding match our mode share goals, because right now the way that our funding is distributed, it doesn't tend to do that. But wanted to actually ask staff, the priorities that you laid out of safety first, then transit, bikeways and pet improvements, and roadways. 1, do you feel that adequately matches our mode share goals? And 2, do you feel like our local funding sources actually support those priorities? And if not, are there maybe some policies or goals that we can incorporate to help make that, at least guide ourselves towards exploring that more robustly than we are right now?
It's probably more of a Rob question, unfortunately.
I think I caught what you were asking.
Yeah, sorry.
The idea, so I don't know how much this is, we've talked about this yet, but our intention is to have an action plan, or I should say an implementation plan, that after the council adopts the TSP, we bring that to them at a later date for implementation of the TSP. It would not be adopted as part of the TSP. It would be a separate item. We could probably bring that to Planning Commission as, I don't know, like, to what extent we'd be looking for Planning Commission recommendations on that, but we'll have to figure that out. But the idea is that there are sort of strategies that relate to moving forward with the TSP that we wouldn't necessarily want to put in the TSP. I don't know if you want to elucidate on that at all.
Yeah, I mean, the funding mechanisms, this is a long-range transportation planning document, so when we start to get into actual funding priorities, that's where you see it really in our capital improvement plan and other more on-the-ground type plans. And this is we want to create a system, this is what we want the system to look like, this is us looking out 20 years. And so it sounds to me that what I think I'm hearing you ask probably doesn't belong in the TSP, but it's worth if there's potential action items or other things that you want to make sure are looked at for those other actions that would support this overall bigger 20-year look, then that would belong in the TSP.
And then the other piece too is like the TSP only prioritizes projects in that we have a 20-year list and a beyond 20-year. So the idea is that the implementation plan could get to a finer level of detail regarding what the priorities are for what projects to move forward sooner rather than later. With, there might be like a 5-year list or a 10-year list within that.
That sounds good. I know that Sustainability Commission expressed concern over this as well. And so just for purposes of circling back with them, and also too, I know we've had some interest in this conversation. When you do put the implementation plan together, maybe scheduling a work session with us would be helpful. I'm sure we'd be interested in seeing what that looks like. Thank you.
I have Commissioner Mills.
Wait, John?
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. If I can, just a couple thoughts, so I'll consider this. Because we heard from the Sustainability Commission and BPAC, the Bicycle Pedestrian Advisory Committee, and some others about this. Couple thoughts. It's real hard on many projects to separate out what is being spent on pedestrians or bicycles versus others. Because if we restripe and add bike lanes, are you just paying for the paint or what? So separating the costs on many projects isn't easy to do that. It struck me that setting a goal on how much to spend on certain modes it's almost like an invitation for waste. It's like, oh, we have to spend $100 million on this, and so let's pave it with gold or something to spend, rather than what the outcomes are, what the projects are. My recommendation to the Bicycle Pedestrian Committee was, if there are certain types of projects or specific projects that you think would get us the most bang for the buck, list those as priorities and say, finish the neighborhood greenways or these bridges or something, to make sure that happens to best meet our goals. They didn't take that recommendation, but those were some of the thoughts we had, and not trying to set a dollar amount.
I think that those are all excellent points, and I think that's why maybe us having a conversation about them would be really helpful. That's a good point, that it might lead to some waste, so thank you.
Thanks.
Commissioner Mills.
Yeah, I'm going to go back to safety and hit it one more time, and then I'll be quick. And I'm under attachment A, agenda item page 12, under the 4 bullets that Kurt had described earlier. And it talks about the overriding book. It says maintain transportation performance and improve safety. And so that's correct. I love that. But then it goes down to the highest priority is to preserve and improve functionality. The next bullet says improve efficiency and safety. The second priority is, and once again, we've made it second there, or third. Okay, just with that. And I think that conflating or putting efficiency and safety in the same bullet diminishes safety.
Okay.
And I think it needs to be its own bullet, Because oftentimes efficiency and safety will be in conflict.
And where those bullets were pulled from, just for sake of reference, was from under the cost effectiveness and finance policies. And so so those changes will be made there. That's where they are, in addition to some of the other stuff about cross-referencing Vision Zero and other
So
places.
it's where I know I'm hitting this extra hard, and I'm hitting it hard because we're talking words here, but eventually we're going to have to talk about people's consciousness about which projects get chosen and which projects are important. And that's what I'm really shooting for here, is a change in how we look at projects, if we're really going to improve safety, and how we decide what to do. Thank you.
Commissioner Taylor?
Some easy questions.
So, quick question for staff. So in terms of the implementation, which I think is great to keep it out of the TSP, considering this is the long-range plan, how does the plan, and without me going back right now, what are the areas that actually, within that longer-range plan, identify and address that there is an implementation process? Just so we address Sustainability Commission, Josh Gove, there's plenty of other pieces of testimony that are saying, how are we going to hold ourselves to it? And I recognize that having the actual implementation plan within it is not viable, but some kind of accountability that that's going to happen and it's going to happen, and to assure it happens.
So there's a couple of things. There's the potential action items that say, here's the framework, here's the system we're creating, here's what we want our system to look like over the next 20 years, and here's the things we plan to do to further that, or here's things that can be done to further that. So you've got your potential action items. This is where we kind of call out what we see as the ways of getting there. You have the benchmarks for our alternative performance measures, which the alternative performance measures are the ones that were set by LCDC in 2001 for the metro area. And so we do have benchmarks that we are tracking for those. But when it comes to internal, triggers of holding ourselves accountable, that you're not going to find that in the long-range transportation system plan.
So I guess my question would be, and we don't necessarily have to talk about it today, is do we have a broader policy that talks about accountability?
Yeah, there's some potential actions listed in here that talk about setting up monitoring and stuff. One of the areas, and they can be strengthened, certainly, so that some we can come back to you with. One of the other areas that overlaps is the monitoring program that's being developed through Envision Eugene. And so I know Heather's been before you several times talking. There's like dozens of measures for housing and affordabilities, and there are at least 5 in there that were transportation related, also that we try to fold into the LCDC stuff. But there can be, probably should be, a totally separate monitoring and reporting system that's both for growth and transportation, and for housing needs, and for the greenhouse gas and climate recovery needs, anything you want that set that up. So, but we can certainly beef up, I think, the potential actions here to better describe the type of process you want.
Commissioner Borowski?
This goes to one more piece of public testimony, and I'm sure you're going to address it, but it was the memo from the DLCD and the things. You're planning on tying those benchmarks in and the performance measures as suggested?
Yes, so we are going to follow up. There's a couple things that we actually want to follow up with them directly about, and we're also going to be writing a formal response just to DLCD that will also be, and to provide some explanation, some additional discussion, and yes.
Great.
Thank you.
I just have a comment. I hope staff is taking great notes, because what we're doing, and this is an excellent discussion, and we're making lots of recommendations and suggestions, but we're not doing it by any formal vote, so that's okay if we're taking good notes and we have the record. So I'm comfortable with that rather than going back, because otherwise it would be very slow. I would like, however, to try to see where we are and what was said to us, and if I may, if I could just suggest, like, is there anyone who has any comments or anything on item number 1 that was discussed? Because there was a recommendation by staff to remove reclassification. I have Commissioner Taylor.
Kurt, did you have something to say before?
Well, before you go too far, I did want to utilize Julia's resource here. One of the major topics that came up at the hearing was the levels of service and congestion.
Well, I thought if we could go through that quickly, we would have time, but we can go to that now if you prefer.
It depends how quickly you can go through the rest.
She's only here
Only
today.
got Kurt today.
Okay, so let's
I'm the least of it. It's
okay,
having
let's
Julia
move
here
to,
today.
let's move to the discussions that were on items 3, 4, 7, 8, and 9, which were LOS related.
Okay, thank you.
So we put together kind of a summary of what the question, response to question, but just maybe just take a step back a little bit. So, and you guys can stop me if I'm telling you things that you already know, which is level of service fundamentally was set up in the 1950s. Basically, as traffic engineers, we wanted to put together a report card to say, how well is the transportation system performing, and how is that performing against what our expectations are? And so the city, right now, the city of Eugene looks at level of service D.
No, go ahead. I'm waiting for after you do your presentation. I wanna
Okay,
get
well,
an
if
idea.
I can actually just answer your questions.
No,
if
that's
that
what,
would be
go ahead. Go ahead, finish your.
better. Okay, so we have 2 sets of level of service we look at. One is for intersections that are controlled by traffic signals, and from that standpoint, and then we have level of service for intersections that are controlled by stop signs, or what I call unsignalized intersections. And at each of those locations, the way that we look at the level of service or the quality of the experience from a driver's standpoint is the amount of delay that someone experiences. So if I'm coming up to, let's say, River Road, Irving, let's use a congested location, and I'm trying to get home at night, how much delay am I going to sit through, not only waiting for the light to turn from red to green, but actually it's the total delay that I experience from the time I slow down, come to a stop, wait for the light to turn from red to green, and then start going again and get through the intersection. And so we look at the average amount of delay that somebody experiences going through a particular location at a signalized intersection. At an unsignalized intersection, what we look at is how much delay do I experience if I'm coming up from the side street and I'm on the stop-controlled approach. I'm trying to think of one off the top of my head to give you guys an example, but I think you know what I'm talking about. So not if I'm going through and not stopping, but how much delay do I look at? And level of service is an indication to city staff and to policymakers to say, where are there potential needs for either minor tweaking of the system in terms of can we better time our traffic signals so that if I'm traveling along the River Road corridor, for example, I'm not stopping and experiencing delay at every traffic signal. Can I introduce the use of technology to better think about my experience as a driver? It's also a surrogate for looking at sometimes there are unsignalized intersections that their time has come to take a look at them as a signal. And so is that level of service being used to look at from a signalized standpoint? So we look at level of service kind of at the broader level. On the TSP level, we looked at just a series of intersections that we felt were kind of a surrogate for the overall system. We also did some generalizations of each of the major corridors in Eugene, and you've probably seen a map in some of the packets that's green, yellow, and red that basically just says, not necessarily using level of service or delay, but in general, how close are we getting to the capacity? And that's the lines that show over River Road. It's shown up as a red, for example, which means we're at or over our capacity in 2035. So when does level of service become important? There are kind of two areas. One is when we're looking at how do we prioritize our future spending and what we're spending towards streets. So the city goes out and does a project on River Road and says, okay, I know that Irving and Hunsaker are both, the delays there are really high. And so maybe those two locations we're going to prioritize over other locations where the delay isn't as high. That's on the public side. On the private side, where level of service comes into play is, say, for example, the hospital is going to expand and add another medical office building. And what we want to understand is, can the transportation system accommodate that expansion of the medical office building without requiring the need for roadway-related improvements? And one of the criteria that the city uses, like many cities around Oregon and actually around the United States, is to say, okay, let's test the impacts of what happens if you put that medical office building in. Are there improvements that are triggered by the hospital? And as such, should we be adding conditions of approval to the land use process to require the hospital to put those improvements in place? So that's kind of a broad level overview of level of service. I know you guys had some real specific questions, but one of the things that many cities, including Eugene, are grappling with right now is the level of service designations were created when capacity and congestion really wasn't an issue. I mean, they were created in the 50s. They were created in an environment where we're starting to get into a road building environment, and we weren't necessarily thinking about neighborhood livability. We weren't necessarily thinking about complete streets. And now we're in a situation, many of communities are in situations where we've got a built infrastructure, neighborhoods have been built, offices have been built, stores have been built, we've brought them closer to the street. We don't want to create a situation, most of us, where somebody has to cross a 9-lane roadway to get from their home to the library. It's a trip that my kids and I make all the time. We walk up to the library. I don't want to have to send my kids across 9 lanes to do that. That's not the kind of community I want to create. And that's a bit of an exaggeration, but some of the level of service designations that were adopted many years ago would require that you widen roadways beyond what's really consistent with what the city's vision is. The other piece of it is there are very limited resources, and as we were talking about earlier, safety is our #1 priority. And a lot of the jurisdictions, and I'll use Washington County in the Portland metro area, for example, the first priority, even in development-related applications, is to look at how do you improve and is the project creating impact on safety, and if so, what is the appropriate mitigation measure? Because safety is our #1 priority, and so how do you focus your monies on that piece of it? And there's a way to craft policies and move forward and to say, we're not just going to throw level service out the door, and we're going to say, sorry, drivers, I don't care how much congestion you experience, but recognizing that we don't have a lot of money, we don't have a lot of right-of-way, and we don't want to create communities that are where the roads are driving our vision and how the community is being created, rather than the notion of community is being driven by, or is driving the ship, and the transportation infrastructure is really being done to support that community.
Commissioner Borowski, followed by Commissioner Randall.
Yeah, so I have a couple comments on this. One is, I think that this is an area that we need to do our best to convey that message, because if you just say, yeah, level of services, you're going to go from D to E citywide, that's a pretty broad brush. And what you did was articulated painting, and so I really hope that we can get that message out there, because the broad brush doesn't play very well, at least in what I've heard from people, and in some of the public testimony that we got. The other concern that I have is the second part of your analysis on the private side. When a new development, when the hospital puts that in, I think our community has come to expect that when new development goes in or the medical office goes in, that if that is going to increase the traffic, that there is going to be some mitigation put on the person who's going to be in the development. And I'm concerned that by lowering the level of service from D to E, that trigger is going to be triggered less often. And yet the community will still be saying, wait a second, you're going to put 200 houses on River Ridge Golf Course, and just because the traffic impact analysis isn't going to make it go from E to F, they're not going to have to help signalize single things. So I think that also, I don't know if there's a way to get to that in the TSP without using LOS as the trigger for types of mitigation on the private side.
Could I address that first and then Catherine? So typically that's not addressed at a TSP level. You'd be addressing it in the development code. And one way that I've seen others and actually have helped others look at their code language is to say, we're expanding it. Used to when you go through development review, your number one transportation related criteria that you need to address is level of service and how does this correspond. What many communities now are starting to shift to is a broadening of the criteria that you look at. So for example, I represent Providence up in Portland, and the number one thing we're working right now on for them for the Prov Portland location is a transportation demand management plan, so a TDM plan, because Prov Portland is in a location where we're not going to widen the roadways even to 5 lanes. And so what type of improvements are we putting into place, from working with TriMet to better improve the service, to improve some of the pedestrian and bicycle, to look at how do you infrastructure around the campus, but then what kind of incentives are the employees being offered to not use their car. And people are doing everything from $3 a day. That's a pretty standard, what we call parking cash out. So looking at TDM plans, what are you doing in that regard? So you can add those requirements into your code, which there is some language related to TDM plans, but you can really strengthen it. Looking at what you can do within the existing right-of-way to improve pedestrian and bicycle. And so people are going more towards the on balance, how are the improvements that you're doing mitigating your impacts to the transportation? So less of a focus just strictly on level of service, but more, are your impacts being mitigated on balance? And that's something that can be an action item if you so desire outside of the TSP.
Yeah, and I agree with Julia said. The level of service, one of the struggles with level of service is it really is about a vehicular experience. Our TIA, our Transportation Impact Analysis requirements that are in Chapter 9 that then have administrative rules for implementation, those would be, in addition, we have administrative rules on the TDM stuff. And those, the current TIA admin rules are really focused on level of service, which is a vehicular experience. And in the most recent update to the transportation planning rule, which is the state's administrative rules, we were able to get in there a piece that actually has to do with alt modes, because it was entirely vehicular experience based. So rolling that into our local makes a lot of sense, and it's definitely supportive of the proposed plan. So all of those are the things that would hopefully roll out of this. But part of the messaging, I think, also is here's how we would go about this.
Thank you.
Commissioner Randall, followed by Commissioner Mills.
I appreciate that information, and I know level of service comes up often in what we see, and it was real helpful. I think Becky Taylor, in her responses, put in the chart of what level of service actually means. And I think whenever we use level of service, it would be helpful, at least on my end, because I don't memorize the table. I don't remember what that means because, in looking at it, we all get kind of freaked out that we're recommending level of service D going to E when the average delay between D and E goes from 30 seconds to 42 seconds. So we're talking about a 12-second difference, and whether that's significant in your mind or my mind, at least you've got something tangible to look at and understand what that really means. And I do agree, though, that I'm glad that the TPR is getting more modes in there than just automobile. I know when the Railroad Quiet Zone, the whole issue on the crash studies is crashes with cars, and all the deaths seem to be pedestrians. But yet it's focused just on car crashes. And so we need to start shifting our measure, I think, on a lot of these things, and especially since this dates back to the 50s. But it is helpful, I think, for me to know what level of service really means going from D to E in tangible seconds, the way we're looking at it.
Commissioner Mills, followed by Commissioner Taylor.
Yeah, I've got several things. I'll try to be quick here. How we go about making these changes is absolutely critical, and I think that so far, given all the efforts that have been made, and not to minimize those, I don't think we're there yet. I also would like to comment about, you talked about the widths of right-of-ways being made larger for efficiency's sake, and how, we can't, my point would be that is still in our contemporary thinking. We just a few years ago finished our Walnut Station development where our right-of-way is 180. It's big. And, so we're planning on big, wide right-of-ways now. And there are a number of things that come into play. All of the things you've mentioned, multimode, that current plan has all of those things which we want to have, and we still have wide streets, and wide streets equal additional safety concerns for pedestrians, as seen on incidents that have happened in other areas. Speed is a factor also. But once again, I'm still very concerned about taking these levels down to E and F, and a 1 OVC is something that I think before you make that move, we better make sure that we've got the public educated and understanding this, because if we don't, there's going to be a big backlash at some point. And why did we do this? How did we ever get into this? This won't happen this year or next year, but years from now we'll be backtracking, or there'll be a move to backtrack on some of this. And I don't think that's what we want. We want to make progress that we can be proud of, and that sustains what we want to do and helps us get to the next level. So I've got more comments here, but I want to yield back and let some other folks have it.
Commissioner Taylor.
Yeah, I wanted to echo what Commissioner Borowski brought up, which was a comment or a note that I had made, that just making sure that we update our development code TIA criteria to be consistent with the transportation system plan. Obviously, and I want to make sure that obviously throughout the development code, we make sure we identify those areas that need to be updated to reflect our concentration on balance. Yeah.
Is that an action in the TSP?
Yeah.
I had something specific which involves safety relative to LOS. If you're a community that hasn't warranted but is very close to having a traffic signal, and now something happens which should trigger that, let's just say, well, you lower the LOS, which how does that affect warrants, and how does safety play in that all of a sudden an engineer doesn't say, well, it based on the new LOS that you can't get your traffic signal?
So actually, there are criteria that are adopted at the national level for when a traffic signal is warranted, and the city of Eugene uses those. And level of service is not part of that criteria. Level of service is really just used to indicate to the traffic engineers, hey, this might be getting close to needing to look at it. But what is looked at from the standpoint of whether a traffic signal should go in or not is a combination of what the traffic volumes are on the side street, the street that's now controlled by a stop sign, what the traffic volumes are on the through street, what the speeds are in the area, and there are also criteria related to the amount of pedestrians that cross at that particular location. And so when we look at whether a traffic signal is or isn't warranted, we go through an analysis exercise that compares the conditions at that specific intersection to that national criteria to say, is it merited at this location? And I'm not sure how Eugene works, but there are some jurisdictions that if those criteria are not met by the national standards, they will not put in a traffic signal for liability purposes. Other folks will say, we're not quite there, but we're close enough, and so we have the funding right now, we're going to put in the traffic signal. But the level of service lowering the level of service would not impact whether a traffic signal were to be put in at a location.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Mills?
Yeah, I'll continue on with a couple of more comments. Talking about level of service, and you were searching for an example at an unsignalized. I'm a regular visitor to South Willamette for shopping in a car, and when I come to an unsignalized intersection, I've noted very strongly that I'm waiting longer now to make my turn and get on there. So that LOS has gone down as we would expect, I think, with the change in what we did there. So once again, you get into the basket of pluses and minuses in the community's decision on what to do there. So that, to me, that was just to highlight your example. Another example that this commission went through a few years ago was a development on West 11th for a number of single-family residents that was going in, and we limited the number of residences going in because of restricted flow on West 11th. And so that's a case in point where when we do this, when we keep levels of service or VC ratios at a higher level, then that can be detrimental to density development. So I understand those things very clearly, but I still think we're on very dangerous ground here.
Commissioner Mills, maybe to follow up, one note is there are several ways that you can approach the level of service discussion, and especially related to unsignalized intersections. And one of the dangers of maintaining a really strict level of service criteria at an unsignalized intersection is then you're left in a situation of there's a couple people trying to turn left at an intersection, but a traffic signal is not warranted, and there's really nothing you can do that is going to improve that experience for a couple of people. And so what I've seen other folks do is to say, okay, at this unsignalized location, our adopted standard is level of service E or even level of service F, because remember, it's delay-based. But if there are more than X number of vehicles on that approach, 20, 50, get over a given hour, and or there are queues that regularly build up on that approach, then mitigation is needed. And so it doesn't, again, just look at what is the delay experienced by one or two people, but how many people are experiencing that delay, and is that delay causing lines of traffic behind that stop sign, which then may result in rear-end accidents, or it may result in people being blocked from being able to get out of other streets that connect into that street. And so it starts to have what I would call upstream implications on other roadways. And so I think as we go forward with implementation of the TSP, there's a lot of ways that you can craft that level of service language that recognizes on balance and recognizes there are safety-related considerations, there are other considerations besides just a pure letter gradation that says, if I'm between 35 and 55 seconds at an unsignalized intersection, that's the only criteria I'm going to look at. So there are several ways, I think, to get at your point about shopping on Willamette, for example.
Quick response. So what you describe, I think, has great merit. And I think it would be far superior to a table with 4 designations for 20 line items. Thank you.
So, I mean, just to get an understanding, Commissioner Mills, to follow up, and recognizing that what our TSP doing is establishing the level of service, what type of, because this is not externally applicable, that the requirements, for example, that you would find in our TIA Development Code and Administrative Rules, those are the externally focused. Those would get applied to developers. Are you looking for additional information and explanation about level of service in the TSP?
That's a good question. I don't know that I can give you a coherent answer. I guess what I'm looking for is a level of comfort that what we have here is going to be sustainable. And I'll use the word politically, but what I mean is with the public and with the support of the public. I guess that's my concern. And I don't think you've got it here.
One of the questions that came up, and Julia can speak to it, and there is some information in here about being more, for lack of a better term, surgical. So you've got D2E citywide, and the question was asked, is there a way to nuance that so it's not simply D2E citywide, that it is more specific to where there's problems? Or, for example, there's a whole lot of streets within our city that aren't near D and won't be near D in 20 years. There's many, many local streets that are functioning at A and B, and we're not expecting those streets in the next 20 years to all of a sudden be functioning at E. And Julie's here, and she can speak to how some other communities do it, I think, not to set you up, but there are different communities do it differently and have levels of service. For example, we have our downtown areas currently at F. It is at level of service F. And so you could have, for example, certain classifications of streets potentially, or certain areas with different levels of service. It's an approach that could be taken if that is the desired.
So Catherine's correct. Local streets, most of our local streets, the local street intersections, 2 intersections within a neighborhood will never approach a level service F condition, likely in the life of the plan. Most there are probably some, and so I'm sure that you could point me to several locations, but usually local streets, the volumes are fairly low, and sometimes they're not even controlled. We've got several. I live in Irvington. There are several intersections where no one has a stop sign. You just slow down, and that's the way that the neighborhood was developed 100 years ago, and it stayed that way. So typically level of service gets applied just at the collector and arterial level. And one of the things that you want to be cautious about when you start looking at, there's a couple of things that when you start looking at different areas of the city and or different roadway classifications. One is where I've seen a couple areas communities struggle in Washington, for example, they have the Growth Management Act. And when you are keeping a real strict level of service, what that happens is it starts pushing growth out to the edges of the community, which is in contrast to a lot of the other goals that you want to have. You want people to be able to locate in areas where we can get to the library, to the store, to my job without having to get in my car. The other piece of it is by locating it on the fringe is now we as a community have to provide the infrastructure out to the fringe where we don't necessarily have the fundamental basis. And so one thing that's been kind of a backlash of GMA or growth management is folks have said, ooh, we don't want to continue to move things out to the sprawling. So we got to be careful about creating really high levels of some places and not in others. The other piece of it is if you were it's very common for people to start like you all did, which is in your downtown area. We've got downtown streets, we've got downtown buildings. Our focus is not on moving cars through. And so we're going to say level service F is okay in those locations. If you start then creating other locations that are less clear than a downtown, I think you need to be very careful about doing a pretty exhaustive effort to say, okay, we want to make sure that we understand and collect data at these locations to understand what the implications are by saying, okay, in Santa Clara, we're going to have this. In the university area, we're going to have this. Down along Amazon Parkway, we're going to have this. And right now, at the TSP level, we looked at a series of just kind of surrogate locations and then just the corridor, the broad brush corridor approach. And so as a community, I think if you wanted to go to I think Kurt called it more of a surgical approach to level service by area, I think you would really want to do a very comprehensive look at what the level service is today and what it's expected to be. And the other things to keep in mind about level service is just level service is indicative of a slice in time. So when I was out there last week on July, whatever day it was, 12th, I was measuring the traffic that was going through that intersection on a particular day, and know that traffic ebbs and flows depending on what the day is, what's going on. And so we would be measuring it at a slice in time. And then we're using a regional model to the best of our abilities to forecast how and where are new households and new jobs going to be created between now and 2035. And how does that indicate where level of service is going to be. So we have to look at all the different tools we have in place, but right now the level of detail that's in the TSP doesn't necessarily lend itself to creating more of a surgical approach to areas. And so what we've seen more and more communities in urban areas, our MPOs go to, is looking at something that would say your volume to capacity ratio of the transportation system is getting closer to 1 in terms of what's acceptable. And then how do you, on balance, mitigate what your impact is as a developer?
I have one comment followed by Commissioner Borowski and then Commissioner Taylor. When lowering D to E citywide, what that meant to me is, okay, I understand, as was indicated, some streets are B and C or whatever, and some are D. If a development came in and impacted that street, if it was a D, and let's say now it went to an E, that would now be acceptable. My question comes in, which gets me with the citywide. If you're on a C street, and because of the way we're going with higher densities and everything, a development comes in that's large and takes that C to an E, it's also acceptable? So you can have that big of a jump and an impact on a street, and it would be acceptable since it said citywide to E.
So there's
rather than D's could go to E.
Yeah, so there's two things, and maybe just to clarify is when you go through a development process, there are two basic paths. One is the development consistent with the existing zoning and the existing comprehensive plan designation? So while that development at the time may seem large, but it is consistent with the zoning designation and what we've said as a community, that's what we want our land use to be on that particular parcel. So it may feel a little pinched right now, but it is getting us towards our zoning. Where you have an additional trigger to look at is that if the development isn't consistent with the permitted zoning. So let's say the zoning is residential and I'm putting institutional in and I need to go to an employment zoning, then I have a more scrutinized test that I need to go through to say, when we put together the TSP and when we put together the comprehensive plan, we didn't envision employment on this particular land. And so that represents a change to the TSP, and so we need to look at a long-term 20-year, does can the transportation system plan function with that change in zoning? So that, I think that's an important recognition, especially in the larger developments, is are we planning for those as a community or are we not? And if we're not, then can the system really accommodate those? And that's that system on balance too. It's not just the roadways. I don't know if that helps or muddies the water at all, but there are two different sets of tests that you look at.
Yeah, I don't want to respond because sometimes the zoning that's there was there a long time ago, and it's not like we're updating our zonings, monthly. So what's there could be impacting local streets, and the developments that I've seen aren't happening on our major corridors per se. They're happening a couple of blocks off, and that's really impacting local streets. I have Commissioner Borowski followed by Commissioner Taylor.
I think I'm going to piggyback on kind of some of the things that Commissioner Mills said, and a point that you brought up, that as far as level of service, D and E basically goes to arterials and collectors. And the implications of what that would mean going forward. And for me, one of the concerns is if you go to D, from D to E, and it's an extra 12 seconds, like Commissioner Randall said, or it's going through, you have to wait 2 light cycles to go through. The impacts aren't going to be as much to what is, I'm going to have to sit through 2 lights is. The concern going forward will be, is that person going to turn off that street and find alternate routes through neighborhoods to get, and increasing cut-through traffic by, if we're talking basically arterials and collectors, and we're not going to upgrade them to keep them moving at 1 cycle per thing. It already happens. We're already having it happen at level D. It's going to increase at level E. Cut through is going to be increased. So that kind of flies in against one of our pillars in Envision Eugene, which is maintain and enhance neighborhood livability. So that's just, again, the explaining it to the neighborhoods, or explaining it well, and then what the ongoing consequences
Well, and I
are.
think that's an important clarification because it's much like parking. So if you, in an area now, have parking that's not being priced, so you can park on street for free, and then you put in on-street parking meters, but you only put them in on the actual street itself and not 2 blocks off the street, then does that mean people are going to start parking in front of my house? And you have to look at it from 2 angles to say, you can't just put in metered parking, but you have to look at what you're doing to protect the existing neighborhoods adjacent to that corridor. And so one of the things actually that came up on the Beaver-Hunsaker project is we were looking at whether there's some cut-through traffic existing. And Chris Henry, who's not here today, from the City Eugene staff, walked through how the criteria that the city looks at to say, is there a cut-through problem occurring either from a traffic volume standpoint or speed? And if these criteria are met, what are the mitigation measures that are important? And so when I looked at those criteria and compared it to other traffic calming programs that are around, the city, in my estimation, does a really nice job of looking at whether traffic calming is appropriate. And so one of the things that you need to look at is to say, is this, again, resulting in an unintended consequence of people cutting through neighborhoods? And if you are recognizing that you've got a corridor, for example, that's getting closer to capacity or reaching that level service E, one of the things the city can do, not to add to their workload, but is to say, are there some obvious cut-through routes that might be affected by this? And what can we do as we're thinking about those? Because there will be a monitoring by city staff.
And to follow up on that, as far as action items go, if maybe one of the action items would be to look at the traffic calming program, because right now the traffic calming program for the city of Eugene is $35,000 a year.
Funding.
Of funding. Or yeah, $30,000
Yeah,
a
which
year
is
of
not
funding.
much,
And there's
yeah.
100 plus projects on the list. So that may be something that we can bring as an action item, saying, hey, we might be increasing cut-through traffic. We might want to think about upping that from $30,000 a year.
Yes, excellent point.
Commissioner Taylor, followed by Commissioner Mills.
So I guess I have a question for staff, because where to best kind of address some of these concerns, because I am supportive overall of decreasing from D to E and this table. And you bring up a lot of great points that are context related. So do we bring up some of these concerns in action items? Or I'm wondering also, in the vehicular performance measurement, there is this one comment that's right after the 3 bullets that said in some cases it might not be possible or desirable to meet the designated mobility target. So it's already kind of stated here. It doesn't address kind of the safety issues or the impact, the ripple effect, upstream effect, I think is what you called it. So, for instance, along queuing lanes where you no longer can access a side local street or cut-through traffic, et cetera. I'm not sure if maybe that sentence we might want to elaborate on that a little bit, so that it's clear to the public that we are considering these things, and that there are then action items that address that.
Catherine, maybe I can work with you and we can figure out how to strengthen that language.
So I think part of it is like, how do we tell the story better about why we're proposing this change? And also just like what some of the consequences might be of not doing it, because, it's kind of like, do you widen your street, your arterials, or do you, do you have the neighborhood cut through traffic, and there's no perfect way.
With a 2-page memo, it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
But getting that across to
Yeah.
public is very important.
I mean, one thing we tried to also emphasize in the TSP, and that, we can look at that again too, is like, how do we use how do we make the traffic signal system just, we're not going to widen our corridor, our arterial corridors, but how can we better use our traffic signals and sort of intelligent transportation to help traffic move through? The emphasis, and if you look at the project list, the emphasis in terms of capacity is really on the state, on the highways, is on Beltline, is like getting it to be more than 1 lane each way between Roosevelt and West 11th, where there's only 1 lane in each direction, and the same thing from Terry to Green Hill. And then the Beltline project from River Road to Coburg Road. I mean, that's really where most of the sort of vehicle capacity from a project perspective is in the TSP.
Commissioner Mills.
I'll be quick. I know we're getting close here. Your comment about tell a better story, amen. I think your time spent telling a better story is absolutely critical for you all. Want to bring up one comment about cut-through. There's another demand management tool that's called avoidance. There's parts of town I don't go to in Eugene in certain parts of the day. I just say, well, I got to go to business A or business B. I choose, and I go to business that has the best parking travel option. And as things get worse, those options either become more restricted or they push me out of town. So that's a concern I have. They also could push me out of town for my residents, which is another thing. It's been a very active conversation we've had here over urban growth boundary. So it's avoidance, but it can become avoidance of Eugene both for business and for living if we're not careful, and that's a concern.
Well, and I think maybe the contrary position to that also is, I've seen instances in Bend and in Portland both where the level of service criteria was set such that a new employer couldn't actually locate there because they couldn't mitigate the level of service. And so that in itself, because the D level of service, they couldn't come up with a transportation system improvement that, number one, the community was willing to accept, and or meet level service D, because it would require widening and or right-of-way that was beyond what could be achieved or desirable to be achieved. And so they have actually moved out to the suburbs, for example, in the Portland area. So it happens both ways. And just a minor note, and I'm going to kind of geek out on you here, which is in the 20-year model that we use to predict how traffic volumes might occur in the 2035, it doesn't recognize the tools that we have at our fingertips in today's world. Don't recognize that there are those trips that are untaken. It still says, if I am a household of family of 4 with a dog, and both of us work, and we live in this neighborhood, these are my travel characteristics. It doesn't recognize that it says, gosh, I may choose that I'm not going to necessarily take that trip in the PM peak hour in the future. Or I may wait until Saturday to take that in the future. It still assumes that those trips are being made similar to what they are today. So that is one of there are soft underbellies to all of the analysis tools, whether it's a traffic tool or a computer-oriented tool. There's always kind of the limitations of those, and I think that's something, because the TSP, it hopefully will not be fixed for 20 years before you look at it again. It hopefully will be a 5 to 7 year update process. You can look at what are innovations to tools that can help better understand the performance of the system in the future.
Commissioner Taylor.
So a quick point is that is one reason why I think our TSP, we are moving in the direction that is giving an option for all types of users to participate. So the scenario you described, for instance, is vehicular focused. So there is going to be a segment of the population that, if given options, and if we are really balancing how we look at our systems, that the choice might be actually to get on your bicycle, because now you have a direct connection to get on your bicycle or to walk safely to actually have some of your needs met. And so I think that's why it's critical that we look at it comprehensively.
I don't see any more hands. Our clock is at 1:30. We sort of ran out of time for this. If I understood Mr. Yeiter when he began, he indicated that our follow-up deliberations would be September 19th and the 26th. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, so everyone understands that. That'll give a lot of time for more thought to review what we have and more information, I guess, relative to some of the larger responses that we had, Santa Clara, Northeast Neighbors, Paul Conti with mud, the LCDC, all of those. Okay.
There'll be some responses to all that, and I think today's discussion is very helpful when we hit some of the major themes, but telling us maybe some of the ways we can come back with recommendations
Okay.
to address or how not to address.
Okay.
And I
Thank you very
can
much.
work with staff and be present at one or both of those if it's appropriate as well to answer more questions.
All right. Commissioner Taylor.
I just want, before we leave today, I just wanted to recognize Kurt Yeiter,
Yeah.
because Kurt is retiring.
Don't recognize them anymore.
This is quite a last project to participate in before retiring, so.
And yet it's lasting far too long for me to wait. This is helpful. You have better storytellers, I think, to help push this through. It's been my pleasure. I've been with the city for 20 years now, and so I've been through the nodal development phases and a lot of things since the last transplant update. So it's been my pleasure, and it's been my pleasure to work with a group such as yours. Very good.
It's been nice working with you, too. I look forward to you filling out a green card to speak.
He does too.
Yeah.
You'll know something's wrong when I'm back here, if you still recognize me. Then.
Very quickly, do we have any items from the commission? Commissioner Nicolelli and then Commissioner Brodsky. Nicolello? I'm sorry, Nicolello. Tried to run
I
that.
should get two. Oh, I realized I didn't grab my placard. I should grab like two different placards and just swap out the O and the I. So two just really quick updates. The first is, just in case you haven't heard, the Oregon Legislative Transportation Action Committee is going to be holding a public hearing in Prince Lucian Campus, PLC 180 at the University of Oregon from 5 to 8 p.m. on Wednesday. So if you want to stop by and talk about kind of just what's important to you and what you'd like to see our legislative action items represent, that's your chance. The second thing is for the public involvement subcommittee. We got together last week to come up with kind of a one-pager of who we are, what we hope to do, and then timelines, and we'll be vetting that internally really fast just to make sure I don't have any really awful spelling errors in there, and then we'll be sending it out to the larger group. We've also scheduled a regular meeting, so we will be meeting the second Tuesday of each month in the Sloat Room. And then I'm also going to be working with Amy on getting a web page up with information so the community will have regular updates and a way to access the work that we're doing. And that should hopefully be up in the next few weeks. And so if you have any questions about that, feel free to talk to me afterwards. And I apologize that there's been a bit of delay in getting this all together. We've been balancing Envision Eugene and pulling the committee together at the same time.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Borowski?
Well, my question has to go to that. The City Council is scheduled to do a work session on the Envision Eugene expansion and the medium-density residential. In the AIS, under the public engagement bullet points, there's a sentence that says, the Planning Commission Public Involvement Subcommittee reviewed this plan on July 11th, and staff incorporated their suggestions. Could you tell us, bring the commission up to what those suggestions were, and is it time to have that before you even talk to the...
Yeah, I don't feel comfortable talking too much about that because Terry and Heather have been really leading that item. In this case...
well, I mean, the whole public involvement plan is online.
Yes.
So I'm just wondering what input the Planning Commission Subcommittee gave.
We were treated as a sounding board in this respect, and they essentially came forth with their summer Envision Eugene outreach items. I believe those were sent out to the larger commission. But I would talk to Heather and Terry if you have any feedback on those. Because once again, I do believe they sent it out to the larger commission with the, just to say, this is what we're doing. Do you have any feedback? And if you did not get that from them, then I think certainly I can follow up with them if you want about that. In terms of our feedback, really, it was Steve, Bill, and I who were there, and we really just talked more about, once again, what is the why of this, where are we at in the process, what kind of information are you hoping to get, and so on. And once again, I can follow up with Terry on that because I do think that an email went out. Does that get at your question, or?
No, I mean, it just, we haven't heard a full report from the committee, and then to see references that the committee suggestions from the committee are being incorporated into things that are going in front of the council. I just wanted to be brought up to date as to what sort of suggestions the committee was making that are going into the public engagement policy on behalf of the Planning Commission.
Yeah, absolutely. I will reach out
It really
to.
wasn't suggestions from our part as much as just
Sounding
seeing, a bit like Commissioner
Okay,
Nicole said.
and
And so I think that's not really worded as well as it could be.
And that's why I just wanted to make sure.
That's
Yeah.
it's an excellent question, Commissioner Borowski. And
It's like, here's what we're
Yeah.
going to present, and what do you think? And
yeah, and I saw that language too and was a little, I thought it was a bit interesting. So, because we're a brand new committee, this is the fun part where we get to really figure out what the guide rails look like and how to, define ourselves and how to write responsibly. So I will definitely follow up and kind of see what we can do to make sure that there's not this confusion in the future. That's a really excellent point.
Seeing none other, any items from staff?
Yeah, I just want to say, well, first of all, I guess I should point out, which you all know, the City Council will be talking about 2 days from now. On the 20th, he'll have a noon work session to talk about Envision Eugene. Two elements, the multifamily housing options mainly, and then the public engagement plan. They're not being asked to make any decisions about the multifamily housing strategies. They're just giving staff direction about which strategies they'd like us to focus on for public engagement, even though we will be hearing from the public about all the different strategies. It's just where we focus our time and energy. And they'll be asked to make a decision about that in the fall. So plenty of time for public discussion about that. Heads up to you all. As far as schedule goes, we also have a public hearing for Piper Lane in front of the hearings official next on July 27th, next Wednesday. We talked a little bit about the next steps for the TSP coming in September, so I won't cover that. But I did want to point out that we will have elections for the Planning Commission on August 8th. And it looks like everybody's going to be here except Commissioner Mills. And
I'll make it if I can.
okay, excellent. And on that same day, we'll be talking about Envision Eugene with you all as well, to give you an update, most likely on the conversation at council and what we're already likely starting to hear from folks in the community. We're already doing some of the public outreach, so give you an update on that and have a chance to talk more about it. And there's more, but I can save that for later, nothing urgent.
Okay, I'm not sure if I told anyone, I will be contacting each of you individually concerning the proposed slate for the vacancies that are coming up. So I'll be talking to you on that. And then following that, before the elections, we'll have our convention in Hawaii. So we'll have, we'll do that so that we can get ready for this and listen.
Great.
Is there anything else from anyone? No? Meeting closed.
I like yours, Chair.
Good plan.